Contract a Commander podcast. I'm Mike Almond, and joining me is my co-host Alex Lapp. Alex, what's up, man?
Not too much, Mike. I'm happy to be here. And today we have an episode about some very fun cards on a very contentious list.
Yeah, we are going to be talking about the political cards on the reserve list. So a lot of people may or may not have seen these because they're on the reserve list. And as part of that, we're actually going to kind of flip the script. And we're going to turn our judge's corner into our magic aficionado, our expert in this field corner, and ask our expert, Alex. Hey, Alex. What is the reserve list? Why? I've heard it talked about 1,000 different times, and I know that it's not a great thing. I don't know why. I don't know what it means. I just know that most of the cards that I see on it are either really, really weird or really, really expensive. Sometimes it's both. So what is the reserve list? Why does it exist?
That's a great question, Mike. So a very long time ago, Magic was very much a different game with a different process of thought around it. Back in when it was created in the mid 90s, the first Magic set had a very small print run. It's a commonly thrown around term that the first set, which was limited edition alpha, only had 1,100 rare cards in the set. Like each rare card, there were only 1,100 copies of it. So that's just to give you an idea of just how limited edition these were. And when we talk about these early Magic sets, we're talking about limited edition alpha, beta, unlimited, which was a slightly larger print run, and revised, which was a much larger print run. But those sets effectively more or less had the same cards in them. There were some variations, but those cards being printed in those sets, especially alpha and to a lesser extent beta, have extraordinarily high value. Many of them do. Some of them don't, but many of them do. And you may be familiar with many of them, such as the Power 9 and especially Black Lotus. Cards like this that are worth many, many thousands and tens of thousands of dollars. Why are they worth so much money? Well, they're worth so much money because there weren't very many of them printed, and they, for the most part, at that time, and some people continue to believe this, that they retain this extremely high value because they never have been reprinted since those days. Now, why haven't those cards been reprinted? Why can't I get a Black Lotus in Commander Legends instead of a Jeweled Lotus, right? Other than the fact that they just didn't happen to print it in that set. Well, they didn't just not happen to print Wizards of the Coast, not happen to print Black Lotus in Commander Legends. It's that they couldn't, is the best way to put it. And that's because of the reserve list. The reserve list was created in 1996. And I'll go on a bit of an anecdote here explaining what was going on at that time. So at that time, Magic had sort of an ongoing policy that they had put in place. This is prior to the reserve list, where they wanted to maintain the value of cards, very valuable cards like Black Lotus and cards such as that, for the purpose of collectors. They believed that it was very important for these cards to have their value preserved on the secondary market. And as a result, there were a lot of players and investors who had invested a lot of money into these cards, even very early in the game. These cards were reaching levels that were very high at the time. I mean, we might gawk today at the idea of a $50 or $100 Black Lotus, but at the time that was unheard of expensive for cardboard. That was right out of the blue. Now, of course, today Black Lotus is in the six-figure area, but back then $100 was considered quite outlandish. But that was important to people, and it remains important to people that Black Lotus would have that value, and that the presumption was that it would continue to have that value. And the reason for that was because of these policies. The first policy was that the white border reprint policy, which was put into place in Magic's early days, and you may have seen some white border cards floating around, especially from older sets.
Yeah.
But there's no new white border cards because they stopped doing that, and we'll get to that in a minute. But white border cards originally were created as reprint cards, right? If a card is printed for the first time, it would be printed as a black border card, and if it were printed any subsequent times as a reprint, then it would instead have a white border. And this was meant to drive a very indelible line between the initial printing, the first edition, and the subsequent printings, later editions. And it was thought that this would be very beneficial to investors, so that they would always be able to feel that their investment was protected, that their card is distinct. They would never print a black border reprint, right? The second one is that they never would reprint a black border card with the same art, with the same rules text, the functional reprints. And this was going fine for the time. These two policies were working fine. The value of the cards overall was increasing or staying steady, and people who had invested money into Magic, for people whom that was important, they felt that their investment was being respected. Now we get to 1995, 1996. At this time, we're seeing larger print runs, especially with the release of Chronicles, which was a reprint set. Chronicles was an entirely reprint set. And the volume of Chronicles, as in the number of cards printed, the print run of Chronicles, was much, much higher. It's a much larger print run than any previous set had ever had by many, many-fold. It was many millions of cards were printed in Chronicles. And the result of this was the devaluation of many Magic cards. Now, they didn't reprint the Power 9, but they did reprint a lot of other cards that people presumed would also be held to that same standard, right? They expected that their investment would be respected, and they felt that even though these cards were in white border, they felt that that it was being devalued, and so there was a big stink, Mike. A lot of people threw a fit over this. They printed tens of millions of reprints in Chronicles, and the prices hit the floor, and everybody panicked. They hit the ceiling. Stuff hit the fan.
The market absolutely dropped
right.
on all the things that they had basically purchased in the stock that they had on these things. And as far as collecting,
a lot of cards that were worth dollars were now worth cents, and that was alarming for people, because it was kind of a wake up call. Not necessarily this specific incident, but that this could and perhaps would continue to happen, and that their investment would fall to zero over time. So there was a market panic. Everybody felt they had to get out of investing in Magic. It wasn't a good time for the people there. They didn't have, in their minds, security that Magic would continue to exist. As we now know, Magic, we joke now about how, such and such killed Magic, or Jewel Lotus is going to kill Magic. Nothing's going to kill Magic, right? Magic is a very resilient game. We know that now. But this was a long time ago. This was only a couple of years into Magic's life, and people were legitimately concerned at that time that Magic was going to die off because they printed their cards into the ground. So, Wizards made a decision at that time. In 1996, March the 4th, they created the concept of the reserve list. And they announced this reserve list in their magazine, which was Duelist Magazine. They made a full spread. And this was a promise that they made to players, that the cards on this reserve list would never be reprinted, functionally reprinted, ever again, in black border or in white border, in that functionally identical form. They left themselves some outs, right? They were still allowed to reprint them in oversized versions. For example, Commander large form factor Commander cards, the plain chase size of cards that you might get in a Commander box, and also the extremely large oversized cards that you may have seen if you've ever browsed Scryfall for example, the Legacy North American Championship events, you may have seen that Black Lotus got new art. That was not printed on a small card. That was printed on a very large card. So that was technically okay. So they have these outs. But that was their agreement that they made with the players. This was this was coming up on 20 years ago now, right? And so they made this agreement. The first version of the reserve list was all the cards from Alpha and Beta that had not also been reprinted in 4th edition or Ice Age. So Alpha and Beta is completely locked off. And then all uncommon and rare cards from Arabian Nights and Antiquities, which were 2 other early sets, that had not yet been reprinted. And then finally, all rare cards from Legends and the Dark that had not been reprinted. Now, Arabian Nights, Antiquities, Legends, and the Dark are the Four Horsemen. They're the sort of vanguard of sets that came out following the Alpha, Beta, and Unlimited sets. So these very, very old sets, many of the cards in them were on this reserve list, which means they're never going to be printed again. And you would think that it would just end there, but Wizards has made revisions, as they're, of course, free to do. They have made changes to the reserve list. Sure. Cards have come off of it, and there have been other changes. But I won't get into all the minutiae of that. But suffice to say, cards have been removed from the reserve list. And also, they have tried to skirt the reserve list. I mentioned briefly a minute ago that they gave themselves an out that premium versions, which is Magic's Wizards of the Coast name for foil cards, that they were allowed to print foil reprints of the reserve list. So this was put to the test in From the Vault Relics and Dual Decks Phyrexia versus the Coalition, where this was in 2010, I believe, and they printed reserve list cards in foil, which, according to the letter of the law, they allowed themselves to do back in 1996. Reaction was quite poor. People did not like that. And so they amended the reserve list again. And they said, okay, we're not going to print them in foil either. So, as it stands, we have a large list of cards that are on the reserve list. Any of them could be removed at any time, but there have not been any revisions since 2010. So I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that there probably won't be any major revisions. But if you'd like, you can always search up online the list of reserve list cards. There's a lot of them. You've probably heard of a lot of them, a lot of the famous ones like the Power 9. But there's also a lot of lesser known ones that are worth very little or don't do very much. And that's more of the technical explanation of the reserve list. But the practical explanation of the reserve list is that now, in the year 2020, many years after the reserve list was created, the result, as you might expect, of not reprinting these very old cards is that, for the most part, and this is not true across the board, but for the more desirable cards on the reserve list, the price has skyrocketed, right? When you think of reserve list,
right, the
first word I think of is expensive, because there's no way that to get these cards cheaply. We talk about the Power 9, we'll talk about the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale, we'll talk about Mishra's Workshop, cards that are thousands of dollars. And they're cool, but you can't justify, spending your money on them. And the fact that many of these cards are so ludicrously expensive and EDH players want to play them has, over time, at least from where I'm sitting, and of course I'm not the entire world, but from my read of the land, the opinion of the reserve list since 2010 has pretty steadily declined. At least from what I can tell, and this may just be because people who are in favor of the reserve list tend not to speak up because they'll kind of get dogpiled on. And sure. But at least from where I'm sitting, people really don't like the reserve list. And I'm one of those people, Mike. I really don't much care for it. And for me, the reason for that is because I believe the game should be accessible first. And maybe a distant 10th or 20th a good investment for investors, right? I really don't care about them. And I understand that may sound callous to some of our listeners, but to me, the investors do not matter. I care about people being able to play the game and not about how much the cards are worth. Mike, how do you feel about the reserve list yourself?
I mean, with you giving me the spark notes of what the reserve list is, because it's obviously it's got some history to it. Mm-hmm. It sounds like, okay, so people were upset that they made extra cards and printed cards and they did different things, and that made the value of what they had go down. And if you were talking like about literally a similar situation where you were talking about, rookie cards for athletes, for different sports, because those are literally printed on cardboard. They are very similar things that change in value based off of a whole lot of different things. And if they reprint a set and they didn't do a whole lot to change it up, well, then that diminishes the value of the investment that you previously made. I totally get the people that are upset that happened. I got upset when I had a Paradox engine in a deck and then they banned Paradox engine, not because, I can't use this Paradox engine anymore, because, this $40 card just turned into like a $3 card. All right, yeah. That kind of sucks, but that's how it goes. Like, you can't talk about something being an investment and then because it's literally stocks at this point. Cards rise and fall depending on what's going on with the game and how much they make of that set, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can't be upset that your investment goes down, because if that was the case, then just everybody can say, hey, it's not fair that my stock went down. Fix it. And then the world economy doesn't go, sorry about that. Here you go. So I also, when you were saying you don't really care about, maybe it'll offend some of our listeners here. We are a commander, group hug, political, how to have more fun playing the game podcast. I don't know how many of those players that we have. And if you're here, we're happy to have you. This is
more power to you, friend.
This is a safe place for you to learn and go outside of your probably Power 9 realm and still have fun in the game. But yeah, it sounds like they tried to compromise to make some people happy that their investments weren't giving them, or that their investments were diminishing, and instead just made everybody kind of unhappy instead of a small minority very unhappy and give them the opportunity to get over it.
Well, it's a really difficult situation, Mike, because when Wizards made this agreement, and it is an agreement, I know that there have been some legal experts that have given their opinion on this and said that it could be interpreted as part of a contract. I'm not really going to comment on that because I'm not a lawyer, but Wizards made this agreement in 1996 because they saw that their player base was hurting. They were panicking, right? And they made a decision that at the time seemed reasonable and at the time alleviated people's concerns. They could not have possibly imagined what the consequences of that decision would have been 15 years later. Today, right? That's some forethinking that would have been difficult to do. Sure, they might have estimated that the cards would become more expensive, but that at the time that was the goal, right? At the time, the idea was to preserve their value, and that was the important thing then. So that's what the reserve list is. Let's read the formal definition, and then we'll go ahead and get started. The reserve list are cards that will never be printed again in a functionally identical form. Yep. What does functionally identical mean? A card is functionally identical if it has the same card type, subtypes, abilities, mana cost, power, and toughness. The name can be different. Okay? So if they printed Black Lotus, but they called it White Lotus, but it had the exact same abilities, that would be breaking the reserve list. Okay? The exclusion of a particular card from the reserve list does not necessarily indicate that that card will be reprinted. As we know, fetch lands have been quite a contentious set of cards that people have called Reserve List 2.0, where Wizards is quite reticent to reprint them. But those are not on the reserve list, but they also don't have to reprint them, right? The reprint policy applies across the board to all versions of cards. That's English and non-English cards. And finally, these policies only apply to tournament legal Magic cards, right? So there are other versions of Magic cards that can be printed that would not be breaking the reserve list. This includes gold border cards. This includes oversized cards, like I mentioned. And this also includes digital cards on Magic Online and Magic Arena. They are allowed to, and they did, print a Vintage Masters set exclusively on Magic Online that reprinted many reserve list cards, but they were only online and you couldn't get them in paper. So that's what the reserve list is today.
You keep talking about an agreement. Who's the agreement with?
That's the thing, right? It's an agreement. I guess you would more call it a promise, right? It's a promise from Wizards to the players, and there's been a lot, like I said, a lot of legal speculation about just how binding is this agreement, right? Like, for example, if Wizards said tomorrow, screw the reserve list, we want money, and we're going to print all the cards as much as we want now. The question is, could anyone sue them for that? And some people say yes, other people say no. I am willing to bet that it would be taken to court. In my layperson opinion, I do not think that that people would be able to recover any significant amount of money from that if they would win any court cases at all. But again, I'm not a lawyer, so don't ask me about that one.
Like all things in Magic, even the stuff outside of Magic, there is strictly defined rules and laws, and these keywords mean these keywords, unless they don't. Fair enough. All right, so I appreciate you kind of explaining this to me, because I've heard about it. I've heard about the reserve list hundreds of times at this point, and all I understood it as is this is a whole bunch of cards that they're not going to make again, and more times they cost a lot of money. Now I know why they made it. Now I know why they cost as much money as they do. And frankly, thanks for convincing me to hate it just a little bit more than I thought I did before.
Famously, Mark Rosewater was asked if you could go back in time and make it such that the reserve list had never been created, would you do that? And he said yes. Mark Rosewater being the principal designer of Magic, and people have largely agreed with his read of that situation. So, given that, let's talk about some of the cards that are on the reserve list that are our style of cards. Maybe they're not the Power 9, but these are the Hug 10, right? These are the cards that we want to see reprinted because they're getting expensive and they have some nice political effects that we like.
And we're going to start from, for the most part, we're going to start from the lower end price-wise and then move our way up with a little bit of a twist at the end here. And we are going to start with our favoritist hippo, the legendary creature Feldegriff. Now, this is a one generic. Yeah, it's the happy hippo. One generic and Bant for a legendary creature Feldegriff. Fair enough.
Feldegriff is a creature type.
Yeah, it is a creature type. There are more than one, kinda. For a green, Feldegriff gains trample until end of turn, and target opponent makes a 1/1 green hippo creature token. For a white, Feldegriff gains flying until end of turn, target opponent gains 2 life. For a blue, return Feldegriff to its owner's hand, target opponent may draw a card. I have heard of the Mystic Feldegriff for a long time. I made a Feldegriff deck based off of everything that I had heard. It's such a fun card. It's when you talk about our type of card, it can be a group hug card. It can be a political card. It's literally a hippo with wings. Like, this is the reason why I don't like the reserve list, because this is currently it's not the most expensive card by any means, but it's an $11 card.
Yeah, Mike. Feldegriff, we gotta respect Feldegriff, right? Feldegriff is the first group hug commander that was ever printed, and it was printed many, many years before group hug or even commander was a thing. This was printed in alliances, and that's why it's on the reserve list. And this is for for the first group hug commander ever made, and for them not designing it as a group hug card, this is an excellent group hug commander. It's very toolboxy. Right. The activated abilities can be activated repeatedly. For example, Feldergriff's third activated ability for a blue, the part that says return Feldergriff to its owner's hand, that's part of the effect, not the cost. So if you were so inclined, you could pay 2 blue, and your opponent would draw 2 cards, or 2 different opponents could draw a card. And that offers a lot of flexibility, right? This is just, I have not personally built a Feldergriff deck, but you really have to pay respect to the original, the OG Group Hug Hippo Feldergriff. I love this card. It's creeping up there in price. You're right. It's $11.65 as we speak.
Bit by bit, yeah.
Yeah, it's this is great. Just great. I wish that we would be able to see a reprint with maybe some new art and a new frame. I'd love to see it, but like we said, it's on the reserve list, so it's probably never going to happen.
Right. And even like we mentioned before, and I kind of made the subtle jab at, Feldergriff is a creature type. They didn't reprint Feldergriff, but they made a friend. They have the questing Feldergriff.
They made the questing Feldergriff.
I mean, you know what? If they had made that a legendary creature...
Wouldn't that have been nice?
Right.
I wonder why they didn't.
Just because they knew that in several years there were going to be people like me and you that just went, aw. And all news is good news because it means that you're talking about it, I guess. I love this card. I've made this deck. It's fun. I'm not sure how good it is, but it's definitely fun to play.
Oh, it's great. Just so much fun.
Moving on to our next card here, Tombstone Stairwell. This is 2 generic, black for a world enchantment with a cumulative upkeep of 1 generic and a black. At the beginning of each upkeep, if Tombstone Stairwell is on the battlefield, each player creates a 2/2 black zombie creature token with haste named Tombspawn for each creature card in their graveyard. At the beginning of each end step, or when Tombstone Stairwell leaves the battlefield, destroy all tokens created with Tombstone Stairwell. They can't be regenerated. Alex, this is a pretty cool card. It's a little bonkers there, buddy.
Yeah, Mike, this card is a very interesting one because it's a black card, and we like when we see political cards in black because black is typically a very self-serving color in the game of Magic. But this is a much older card, and it has a very political effect that is quite nice. So let's go through that. We'll make, at the beginning of each upkeep, each player will create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with haste for each creature card in their graveyard. That means every upkeep, every player makes that many tokens. It's not that they make that many tokens on their upkeep. So we're getting a lot of tokens being created, which is great.
All the time.
But we're also getting a lot of death triggers at each end step, which is also great. So we're giving people free stuff, and presumably, if you have this in your deck, you also want a lot of death triggers happening. I mean, this can be causing 5, 10, 15, 25 death triggers per turn. Easily. And it has a pretty minor cumulative upkeep cost. It does get up there. Let's briefly remind our listeners, maybe for those who are just joining us, because we have 2 things on here that they may not be familiar with. The first one is World Enchantment. World Enchantment is an older world type. It's a super type. It's on the older side. They really don't print it that much anymore. But long story short, if there are 2 or more world permanents on the battlefield, then all but the most recent one will go to the graveyard. So Tombstone Stairwell, if there's a second copy of it, the old one goes to the graveyard. If you have any other world permanent, then this one will go to the graveyard instead. The second one is Cumulative Upkeep, which is an older mechanic that basically is a cumulatively increasing cost. Cumulative Upkeep says, at the beginning of your upkeep, put an age counter on this permanent, then sacrifice it unless you pay its upkeep cost for each age counter on it. So you'll always have a choice at the beginning of your upkeep. You can say, okay, I want to keep this permanent, so I'm going to pay 1 and a black with an age counter. The next turn, you're going to put another age counter on it and pay it 2 and 2 black. and the next it'll be a third age counter and 3 black. You see it increases each time. But you always have the option to say, that's too expensive, I don't want to pay it. And when you choose that option, you'll sacrifice it. Okay, it'll go to your graveyard.
Right.
The third thing I wanted to mention is that this is an abnormal effect, the final clause. At the beginning of each end step, or when Tombstone Stairwell leaves the battlefield, destroy all tokens created with Tombstone Stairwell and they can't be regenerated. That's typically not how they would template it today, Mike. Today they would say you would sacrifice those tokens. So this is quite distinct. If you are able to give your creatures indestructible, and there are many ways to do that, then every turn you will make a bunch of tokens and you will keep your tokens, and then you'll make more. So there are a lot of interesting ways to play this card, and the last thing to note here is that they have haste. So every turn someone's going to make a bunch of tokens, and then they can swing with them and sacrifice them, do whatever they want. You're giving people a lot of free stuff for not a lot of cost, and this is just a great card. It's in mono black. It's not what you would typically see in mono black, and it's $15. It's $14.58 right now. It was printed in Mirage, and this card has gone up in price, of course, over the past couple of years. I've been keeping an eye on it ever since I heard about it first from the EDH Rec podcast a couple of years ago.
Sure.
And at that time, it was in the $4 or $5 range, and it's tripled in price since then. So if this sounds interesting to you, probably pick it up sooner rather than later, right?
I've literally written it down on a sideboard here because I do have at least 2 decks that I'm sitting at going, oh yeah, no, this would wreck shop in there.
Oh, it's great.
And again, it's a
great.
Cumulative upkeep. So it's a cumulative upkeep, but unlike most group hug or symmetrical effects, this is something that you play it, and on your opponent's turn, it actually does affect you because each upkeep, each player.
Right.
And that's
the big
pretty
thing.
unique. Holy cow, this is in an Eldrazi monument, and just mwah, everything's okay.
With Eldrazi monument, yeah, absolutely.
Moving on to our next card here, we have, and I'm gonna do my best, Anvil of Bogardan. Yeah,
Bogardan.
Dang it! Every single time. This is a 2 generic artifact. Players have no maximum hand size. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card, then discards a card. Okay, so this is everybody having just all of the cards and drawing an extra card at the cost of your looting when you do so. You're discarding a card for the additional card you're drawing at your draw step. That's a pretty cool effect, Alex.
It really is, Mike. This is the only effect in the game that I'm aware of, and this may have changed since I last looked at this, that makes it so that no player has a maximum hand size, right? And that's a very powerful effect, because typically that effect, we know that costs 0, typically for yourself. Spellbook costs 0. It has only that effect. You have no max hand size.
Yeah.
And then we have Reliquary Tower, which is a generic land that taps for 1 colorless, and also you have no maximum hand size. Now, there's been many contentious arguments over the years over whether this is a valuable effect or not, but the fact of the matter is that if you're giving it to someone for free, it's worth a lot more than if you're deciding whether or not to include it in your own deck personally, and whether it's worth a slot in your own deck. So this is much more value. Players have no maximum hand size. And then, like you said, we have the additional draw on the draw step, and then the discard, which is looting. And this is really nice because you can get cards out of your hand that you don't want in your hand. You can pitch cards to the graveyard that you want to reanimate. You can just use that additional value. You can get rid of a land you don't need and then play it with Crucible of Worlds. There's a lot of things that we got for an artifact for 2 mana. It's just got some solid value on it. And this is a group hug card that you really don't see very often, Mike, and that's because it's almost $29. It was printed in Visions.
Right.
And I remember 3 years ago, this card was $12 or $10. So it's definitely gone up, as reserve list cards tend to do. So if this card sounds interesting to you, like all the other ones, pick it up, right?
Yes. I will say the one exception to what you said is they did print. I think it was Throne of Eldraine. They did.
You're
Folio
right.
of
They
Fancies.
did. They did.
So, but that one.
I knew
so
I
they
was
did,
forgetting
They did
one.
the players have no. It's all good. I was gonna say like I think there's one, and then I started digging and I couldn't remember it off the top of my head. But I'm guessing.
Folio of Fancies. So
Okay.
in almost in 15 years, right? They've only printed
there's
one
two.
other card that has this effect, and it's a blue card. So if you want this effect and you're not in blue, this is your only option, right?
Right. This is me getting back at you for my screw up on the salamanders thing when we were talking about how there are.
To be
like
fair, you
six,
forgot
and there's actually
several
13,
salamanders. Yeah.
Oh, right. But well, again, you forgot half of all of the card effects that do this, and I forgot about half of all of the salamanders that
half.
existed in Magic.
That's a good point.
So
One out of
it's
two
even.
is half, Mike. Yes.
I should move on before this gets any more detailed. Our next card is bonkers. Dream
What a
Halls.
fun one.
3
Yeah.
generic, 2 blue for an enchantment. Rather than pay the mana cost for a spell, its controller may discard a card that shares a color with that spell. Alex, that sounds like, and I say this a little facetiously because this is one of those effects that, hey, political and group hug and all sorts of good stuff. This is one of those cards that if somebody plays it, it feels like they're playing it and the next step is them winning the game. But holy cow, it's such a cool card. It's so fun to see the stack get 35 cards high because it's who has access to card draw right now, because that's all that matters. I love this card.
Yeah, Mike, this card is dangerous. This is an extremely powerful effect. As we like to say, as Commander players like to say, when you cheat the entire casting cost of a spell, that's the best value that you're ever going to get. And you're able to do that for every spell. This is omniscience for the table with the minor tax of discard a card that shares a color.
Discard a card.
Right.
Yep.
So let's be clear. This means that you cannot choose to cast colorless spells without paying their mana cost.
Correct.
Because there are no cards that share a color with colorless cards because they don't have a color. Right. So you would only be able to do colored spells. However, everything else is fair game. Right? Artifacts and lands, which aren't spells, are the only cards that you can't play off of this. And as you said, I have fond memories of this hitting the table and the stack goes just bananas. The counterspell wars are completely off the chain. There's 9 counterspells on the stack. There's 20 other effects on the stack. People are just obliterating their decks. The entire table is covered in cards. This is one of the most bonkers card. It's like taking off the limiter off your motor and just letting it go redline flat out. This is like Tempting Worm,
nos.
but in blue, right? Where Tempting Worm lets everybody vomit their hand onto the battlefield. This lets everybody vomit their deck onto the battlefield.
Right.
I love this card. But Mike, it's $28.
Yeah, it's extremely good. It's pretty pricey. And it is one of those cards that it hits the table and you will be able to tell who has a chance of winning the game just by looking at everybody's face when it hits the table. If they smile, they've got something ready. If they go, oh no, this is about to get bad, someone's holding on to a bunch of lands or something because oof.
Yeah.
It is bonkers and it is good. Moving on to a different type of bonkers, Allurin. This is a 2 generic green enchantment. Any player may cast creature spells with converted mana costs 3 or less without paying their mana costs and as though they had flash. So it's group huggy. It's political. This is the card that I went, oh, I was aware. This is one of the few cards I was very aware of before we had this discussion and making our outline, and it's the one that I knew as soon as Chulane was announced. I went, oh, so that's just gonna go in that deck, and that's the entire deck. It's fine. It's fine.
Right.
Allurin and Zoom.
This card and Dream Halls, but especially Allurin, really exemplifies the raw power of symmetric effects, right? When you have a deck that's built around Allurin, as this is a very popular legacy card, then the amount of advantage you can extract from it, even though it is symmetric, is so great that you can just put everything onto the battlefield and immediately gain massive, massive value. Even though anyone can take advantage of it, usually they can't. How many people have a bunch of creature spells that are 3 or less and they have a lot of value on them, right? Not too many people have a lot of those cards in their hand. If you're playing Elf Ball or any other kind of low to the ground creature deck in green, this is an incredibly good card. Let's read the flavor text, shall we? Squee bounced up and down. I sees a horsey and a piggy, and if you don't shut up, hissed Mary, you'll see a kidney and a spleeny.
Definitely
right, so that's
best flavor
Squee
text.
and Miri from the Weatherlight Saga. Mike, this card is $50. This is a $50 card from Tempest, and again, this really illustrates just the sheer power of symmetric group hug, quote-unquote, style cards, because, wow, you can really pop off with this one.
It's another one of those, it's a group hug symmetrical effect that when you play it, you probably win the game if you're playing it. We're going to have to do another 55 episodes on telling people that symmetrical effects are good.
They're good,
be
Mike.
Smart about how you build your deck.
They're good.
Less symmetrical, but it could be political, is our next card.
Oh, it's political.
Hollow. Oh, for sure. This is a legendary land. Tap, add 1 colorless mana. Pay a green and tap, regenerate target creature. I feel like regenerating a creature is a pretty effective ability in our format. Especially if it costs you a green and a land to do so for any creature. Alex?
Yeah. Mike, this regenerate target creature for 1 mana, which is effectively 2 mana because it's green and you tap
because
itself.
Because it's a land.
Right.
Yep.
So effectively it's 2 mana at instant speed, regenerate target creature. Now, Mike, there are effects that destroy creatures and don't allow them to regenerate. They do exist. Yep. And they are popular. Yep. Wrath of God, for example. But not all board wipes say those creatures can't regenerate. Not all spot removal says that creature can't regenerate. And when they don't, that's when you get to slide this card up on your board state, lean across the board, across the table, and say, hey, how would you like to keep that extremely powerful creature that just got spot removed? And they say, wait, what? How do I do that? And the answer is, what can you do for me? And the cost for that is a green and tapping this land. And the paper money cost for that is going to be $65 because this card has not been reprinted since Urza's Destiny. Wow, Mike, this land is super strong effect on this land. Like, we need to realize just how cheap that is for a land, right? Not the money cost, that's quite expensive, but the green cost, a green mana, that's quite cheap. Go on, Mike.
The other part of it is it's not a useless land if there's nothing to regenerate. Great, you can tap it for a colorless, which is awesome.
Exactly.
The other part of that is we're gonna hit this so many times because I don't feel that people know it enough. The most powerful time a counterspell can exist is when it saves you from losing the game or when it wins you the game. The second most powerful a counterspell can be is when you have it in your hand and everybody knows it because it counters everything they were gonna do instead because they know you have it. Regenerate target creature on a stick is you being able to say, you can go ahead and target something I want to keep on my side of the board. but all you're going to do is lose the card. You should try and target that guy instead. Unfortunately, you can also save said guy and save their stuff too. You have to have, like you said, some of these specific destroy this creature or all creatures, they can't be regenerated text.
Or exile or sacrifice or bounce. Right.
Right. They have to have specific ways to get around this card. It's extremely expensive, but you're right. It is extremely good.
So let's briefly talk before we move on about what Regenerate is, because that's
please.
An ability that we don't really see very much anymore. So let's briefly discuss it. You may have seen regenerated creature you control on Golgari Charm. You may have seen on Wrath of God, for example, this creature can't be regenerated. Destroy creatures that can't be regenerated. Regenerate target permanent. Regenerate permanent. That means the next time that permanent would be destroyed this turn, instead tap that permanent. So it acts kind of like a shield, right? It doesn't have to be untapped for the regenerate effect to work. That's just something that's going to happen. It's going to be tapped if it's untapped, right? Now, we also talked about can't. And can't be regenerated means can't be regenerated. So, if it says it can't be regenerated, and you try to make something regenerate, all you're going to do is waste the ability, okay? Right. So, great card, great effect. If it weren't $65, I'd be running it in all my green decks.
No, it's an amazing card. Moving on to another extremely amazing card, and another one of those, oh no. I think I'm sensing a theme. Academy Rector. 3 generic and a white for a 1/2 human cleric. When Academy Rector dies, you may exile it. If you do, search your library for an enchantment card, put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. This is ridiculous. This is such a good card.
This is from the era back when white cards were allowed to be extremely powerful.
Yes.
Wow, this card's fantastic. Now, our listeners might be wondering, why is Academy Rector, which in my mind means I'm about to fetch Omniscience, in your political cards list? And that's because, just like Veteran Explorer, one of our favorite cards, this card has a powerful effect that may need a little bit of cooperation to get it going. Because just like Veteran Explorer, this card can't get its own effect by itself, of its own volition. It can't sacrifice itself. You need to either be able to sacrifice it or have another player remove it by asking them to attack into you and you blocking with her, the Academy Rector. And then you can get an effect that is probably very powerful, but maybe you don't point it at the player that just helped you get it. So there's your political effect right there, Mike. This is a ludicrously powerful card. Any effect, like we said, that gets something for free is great. But any effect that gets something for free from your library onto the battlefield is absurdly good.
Gross.
And that's what this card does for 4 mana. For 4 mana, but this card is $76 because it was last printed in Ursa's Destiny. Here's the good news. It was reprinted, quote-unquote, as a gold border card in the World Championship Deck 2000 series, and that card is only, quote-unquote, $13.60. So, if you are trying to play a great white card with a nice political tint to it, and you're not trying to pay $76, but you are trying to pay less than that, maybe try the gold border, just from where I'm sitting.
Mm-hmm. This is one of those, when we talk about the best cards in white, this would be something that would easily, like, if we were really looking at it in a vacuum and all cards are equal, this is in the top 10 pretty easily. But the whole $76 price tag and it being on the reserve list and everything kind of makes it to where it gets put out of your mind for the most part until you're playing a game and it shows up on the table.
They did print her a sister in Battle Bond. They printed a card called Arena Rector, which has a very similar effect, but instead she'll tutor a planeswalker to the battlefield. Now, that card isn't on the reserve list, so you can definitely pick that one up. But I would argue that that's probably not quite as powerful as Academy Rector.
No.
The most powerful Planeswalker you can get is really not going to be quite as good as the most powerful enchantment you can get. So that's... I have this card in my Kaikar deck, and when I need to, I will go get Overwhelming Splendor and lock out one of the players or any other enchantment I need to go find. What a great card.
Right.
I love her so much.
Yeah, unfortunately, her sister, the best thing that can happen is getting a Planeswalker when you have a doubling season or something out. And the best way to have a doubling season out is to have played Academy Rector. I found it early. Anyway.
Womp womp.
Moving on to our next card. This is one that this was actually probably my that's how Magic works cards, because Earthcraft is an insanely awesome enchantment that was my first introduction into the the reserve list means things are expensive. One generic and a green. Tap an untapped creature you control. Untap target basic land. Alex, it seems like there's a lot of effects in Magic that like to tap and untap creatures for value and synergy and infinite, and oh boy.
Yeah, Mike, Earthcraft, and I wonder, I'm not sure when you had that oh crap moment, but I wonder if that was when I was running Earthcraft in my Kaneo Centura deck and you saw me play it.
Mm-hmm. That was it.
Fantastic.
Oh, that's a cool card.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that before. I want that. And then I looked it up on my phone and said, no, I do not. I do not want that.
Earthcraft is a very powerful effect. Now, they have printed a very similar effect to Earthcraft called Cryptolith Rite. It's much cheaper. Mm-hmm. That's also a 1 and a green enchantment that says creatures you control have tap this creature with the tap symbol and add 1 mana of any color. Now, to the untrained eye, that's the same effect, right?
Same thing,
or an
cheaper,
even better
love
effect.
It. Except.
Right. And you can get any color of mana, except, Mike, if that card were on the reserve list, I wouldn't be talking about it. And that's because this can untap any basic land, including anyone else. Mike, how many times have you been at the table and your opponent is tapping out to play their next spell and they say, if only I had 1 more mana?
Yep.
And that's when you get to look at your Earthcraft and say, what if you had 1 more mana? What would you do then? And they say, they kind of shift uncomfortably in their seat, like ready to make a deal with the devil. And then fun things start to happen. Mike, this card is $100, and it's banned in Legacy because it is so strong. This card is a 2-card combo with Squirrel's Nest. That may not be why it's banned in Legacy, but that's just something I wanted to mention. Squirrel's Nest is a enchantment aura that says enchant land, and enchanted land has tap, create a 1/1 green squirrel creature token. So, as you can see, if you enchant a land with this, a basic land, for example, and then you tap that basic land, make a squirrel, and then tap that squirrel to untap that basic land, now you have infinite squirrels, and you could take out, for example, Emrakul. The reason why you can do that is another very important feature of this card, Mike, and another thing that sets it apart from Cryptolith Rite. And this may not be immediately obvious to our listeners because they're not necessarily looking at that card. And that's because this card has the text written out, tap an untapped creature you control, : but it doesn't have the tap symbol. And that's a very important distinction, Mike, in the rules in the world of Magic. Because when you have the tap symbol, or the untap symbol for that matter, that means that that is a cost that can't be paid by a creature with Summoning Sickness. And of course, Summoning Sickness is an effect on a creature that doesn't allow it to pay tap effects if it has not entered the battlefield, or if it has entered the battlefield, since your most recent turn, or has not been under your control since the beginning of your most recent turn. So, if you're playing a creature with Cryptolith Right, you wouldn't be able to tap it for mana right away because it has that tap symbol. Earthcraft, completely different story. You can tap that creature right away and get a free, just 1 mana refund. Mike, this card is so powerful and so political. One of the strongest political effects, in my opinion, is the ability to donate mana at a rate of your choosing. A very specific amount of mana at a specific time can turn the entire tide of a turn and make you a strong ally or allow you to say no to somebody who you really need to say no to. And that's why it's such a shame, like, that this card is over $100. So,
yeah,
if you want to play it, maybe just proxy it because, wow, that's expensive. It was printed in Tempest.
Yeah, it's only 1997 at that point. It's okay. It's not that long.
Yeah, that was 97. Yeah.
There you go.
No, that was a while ago.
Yeah, you know. The
land
a
gives up
card.
little, but we're the masters of persuasion.
Eladamri, Lord of Leaves, who's not a cheap card in his own right. It's such a cool card. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back with a couple more cards and a little bit of advice for newer and older players before we close out with some cards that aren't near the same cost level as anything else that we're talking about today. But
we're not trying to flex on anyone
do have
here.
Some
like,
pretty
if
cool
you can't afford these cards, that's the point, right? We're talking about these cards because they're too expensive.
Right. If you can't afford these cards, it's cool.
They are too expensive. That's the point, right? We want them to be reprinted so that everyone can play these fun and awesome cards.
Right. Exactly. This is a show and an episode about information as well as a public service announcement. Hey guys, wouldn't it be cool if these were printed? / terrifying. Thanks, Wizards. We'll be right back. Hey, it's Present Mike filling in for Past Mike. Our audio has gotten so much better. Thanks for sticking around with us. So we're going to talk about some cards that are really underplayed. We each think that we're bringing some really interesting cards to the table, and if you want to grab them or any other cards, you can help us out in the process. We have partnered with TCGplayer.com, so if you're looking for any singles, sealed product, deck boxes, sleeves, playmats, really anything to spice up your game experience, go to bit.ly/EDHsocial or click on the link in our show notes. You don't pay anything extra, and you'll really help us out by buying all the things you were going to anyway. That's bit.ly/EDHsocial or click the link in our show notes. Back to the show. All right, we're back. We're going to move on to our next card here, which is another pretty infamous one when it hits the table, and that is Gilded Drake. 1 generic and a blue for a 3/3 Drake with flying. When Gilded Drake enters the battlefield, exchange control of Gilded Drake and up to 1 target creature an opponent controls. If you don't or can't make an exchange, sacrifice Gilded Drake. This ability still resolves if its target becomes illegal, with the awesome flavor text of Buyer Beware. Alex, this is a 2-mana swapsies.
Yeah, Mike, this is far more powerful than your average exchange effect, right? Because your average exchange effect, even if it were 2 mana, exchange control effects in Magic are very particular. And by default, they say if the exchange becomes uneven, for example, if you're giving something to someone else and they're giving something to you, and in response to your ability, you sacrifice the thing that you were going to give them, then under normal circumstances, the exchange doesn't happen. The game tries to keep it fair. However, Gilded Drake has the clause, this ability still resolves if its target becomes illegal. So you're always going to give Gilded Drake away.
Right.
And the ability will still resolve there. Even if the opponent doesn't have that creature anymore, they're still going to gain control of Gilded Drake. And this effect, you might look at it and think it's like a theft effect, right? Like you're stealing something from another player. But this has quite a bit of potential, right? Because let's say, for example, you were able to give this thing flash somehow. There are many ways to give creatures flash these days. Let's say you control a Lurin, and it's combat, and somebody's swinging a big beefy creature at you. Well, in response to them declaring attackers, you can flash out Gilded Drake and gain control of their creature, and they gain control of Gilded Drake, and their creature's not attacking anymore. And now you have a big creature. So you didn't get attacked, and now you stole their creature, which is pretty great. But there's more uses for this, Mike. You can use this to gain control of somebody's creature to make use of it if they are not able to in that time. For example, let's say that something really bad is about to happen, and you look across the board and see something that somebody else could use, but they don't have the mana to activate its ability, for example. I know I'm being really vague, but that's just because there's so many different things you can do. You could play this, get that creature, make use of it, and save the day. There's so many things you can do with this, but I think the number one reason, Mike, why I included this card in our list is, of course, because it's a Zedruu staple. This is probably the single most expensive card that you'll ever see in a Zedruu deck. Mike, this card is $236. It was reprinted in Urza's Saga. Wow, cha-ching indeed. What a powerful, powerful effect. And yeah, good luck affording that one.
Just imagine making a bunch of copies of this. Just write a for publication, Gilded Drake. I would like to take all of these things. Enjoy your 3/3
Buyer beware.
Buyer beware. Awesome. I've got decks that cost less than this card. And a couple of the other ones we're going to talk about in just a second.
So for number one, we have something that's a little bit different because I wanted to include these cards on the list, but I didn't want to clog the list up with them, right? Because there's 4 of these cards, and these cards are all
and there's similar
wheels.
Effects.
Yeah. Right. They're wheel-like effects. They all do very similar things. So we're going to say that these 4 cards are number one, and the card we'll start with is the cheapest one, Mike, with a Memory Jar.
Memory Jar. Yes, 5 generic artifact. Tap and sacrifice Memory Jar. Each player exiles all the cards from their hand face down and draws 7 cards at the beginning of the next end step. Each player discards their hand and returns to their hand each card they exiled this way. Okay. Put your hand down, draw 7, discard your hand at the next end step, and bring your hand back. So it's I don't know. Is that even a wheel so much as it's just a, hey, for this turn, I would like 7 new cards, please?
Yeah, this card, Buck, has quite a few interesting effects to it. This is not a normal wheel, right? Because a normal wheel involves you discarding your hand and drawing a certain number of cards. But this almost like protects your hand. And it's at instant speed.
Yeah.
So in my head, I envision this card as almost like having an additional effect as a hand defense option. As in, let's say that somebody's doing, what's that card? Sire of Insanity. Sire of Insanity says at the beginning of each end step, each player's end step, that player discards their hand. Right? You can use this effect to save that player's hand. It gets exiled, so they can't discard it. They'll draw a fresh hand of cards, and then those will be the cards that get sacrificed, or get discarded, excuse me. And then at the beginning of the following end step, because that end step has already begun, then they will get their hand back. So this is almost like an anti-wheel as much as it is a wheel. But even more so than that, Mike, is its primary function, which is each player draws 7 cards for 0 mana. Yeah.
There is that.
Mike, this card is banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage. It's really strong, and it's $36.
Well, let's move on to something that's only, near 3 times that. With Time Spiral. 4 generic, 2 blue for a sorcery. Exile Time Spiral. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, then draws 7 cards. You untap up to 6 lands. Oh.
Ooh. Oh, my. Now, that's an expensive wheel, but it's expensive in the initial investment because really it costs, at the worst, it's going to cost 0, but it could cost much less than 0. For example, if you're untapping a Gaia's Cradle or something like that, then this is costing like -20, right? It's a pretty good effect.
Always nice.
Yeah.
Or if you've got a mana doubler of some effect. This is a really good wheel. It's also a fairly expensive wheel. Not compared to the other ones that we're going to talk about here. Yeah, $112. That's hold on. Let me do the math. Not cheap.
Expensive.
Not cheap is the actual number.
It's not cheap.
Very good.
And before we continue, I just want to
of course.
I just want to reiterate that wheels are not typically thought of, Mike, as a political effect, right? When people see wheels, they're not thinking like we do of, oh my gosh, for such little mana, for the investment of 6 mana, or even much less than that, all the players get to draw a ton of cards. Typically, you're trying to hurt people with that, right? You're using Nekusar. You're using cards like that, Teferi's Puzzle Box, that just mess with players' plans so they can't ever actually get anything done. But sometimes a wheel is a much needed effect. For example, and that change can happen so easily. All you have to do is look at the players that you want to be friendly with, and that can be any number of players, and say, hey, how would you feel about wheeling right now? And if they say, oh my god, yes, thank you, I only have lands, then this is now a political card. And that's why.
Or if a potential ally has 2 cards in hand.
Yeah.
Hey, would you
Some
like to
wheels
draw
like
up
this
7?
one draw 7 cards.
Sure.
Yep.
It can be political. It can be used to get yourself back up into the running if you don't have enough. Wheels are great. Wheelie good, I believe is the phrase.
Oh my god.
Next one, Wheel of Fortune, or as it's in our Scryfall chat here, because it's the 4 in black border, Rue de la Fortune. 2 generic and a red for a sorcery. Each player discards their hand, then draws 7 cards. Okay, so that's a 3 mana in red wheel for everybody. To draw up to
really
7,
cheap,
regardless of what you had.
3 mana, each player draws 7. Yeah.
It's pretty solid. About that, though.
Yeah. It's Banded Legacy. It's restricted in Vintage.
Yep.
And it costs $233.
Yeah. Well, thankfully, we've only got 1 card left, so at least it's not going to get much worse.
Well, it's a wheel,
Time Twister.
So yeah.
Well, $200 though. Let's get real.
200's a bargain compared to Time Twister.
I know, I'm being facetious. Time Twister, 2 generic and a blue for a sorcery. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, then draws 7 cards. Then put Time Twister into its owner's graveyard. Fair enough. Before we say literally anything about this card, it's just under $2,900. Go ahead, Alex.
Mike, that's because... Mike, this card's $2,900 because it's in the Power 9. Mike, this is the only Power 9 card that is legal in Commander. And that is quite fascinating. This card is also Banded Legacy and restricted in Vintage. Why is this card $2,900? Well, it's on the reserve list. It's in the Power 9. It also hasn't been reprinted since Unlimited. So unlike a lot of reserve list cards, its most recent printing is a very, very long time ago. But you can get quite similar to this effect, as we've seen. Time Spiral is remarkably similar to this. It costs more mana initially, but you get the mana back. I mean, the Wheel of Fortune is similar to this, and it costs 1/10 of it. But this is what the reserve list can do. This is the worst of it, right?
I guess putting your graveyard into your library is worth a little bit over $2,000. Then I don't know what to say. Anytime that I look on EDHREC and I'm just kind of browsing cards and things along those lines. I know, hey, here are these decks, and then every once in a while one of them will pop up and it'll say, "Oh, this deck is $4,000," and I always freak out when I see that because how is that possible? This is one of the cards that's usually in there.
Yeah, or a dual land or something.
Yeah. It's the reserve list is weird, man. It's weird.
We've been talking about a lot of cards. I know we had that spiel at the beginning about the reserve list, but really, the primary reason why I don't like the reserve list, I'll reiterate now, is because it makes these cards, these great political cards, inaccessible. And we know that they're not going to reprint these. Wizards won't reprint these anytime soon if they have their way. So, knowing that, if you heard us talk about any cards today, and they sounded really fun, and then you looked at the price tag,
proxy it,
and your wallet fell open and kind of a moth came out of it, proxy it. Proxy it. I'm telling you,
and
don't spend $3,000 on a Magic card to play it at your kitchen table. Proxy it.
Ever.
Now, don't go into a tournament with these and proxy it, but your kitchen table, proxy the crap out of it.
I'm not turning on the reserve list. I'm not changing my mind on it. I don't like it in general. However, when you talk about, the reserve list keeps some of these political cards from coming back, I look at the things that Earthcraft and Dream Halls can do, and I say, you know what? It's okay if they're not everywhere. I don't want everyone.
I don't like that though, Mike. We've talked about this. Even if you don't feel comfortable with the power level of Commander, and you wouldn't want cards like Earthcraft and Time Twister running around rampant, the solution to that is not let's make it so only the rich players can play them.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
The important thing is that players choose not to put them in their deck, not that they can't.
Like everything else, you play the cards. The cards don't play you. So that's our conversation on the political cards on the reserve list that just, at the very least, whether it's because they're powerful, whether it's because it's a unique effect, or just because we want to talk about them because they're cool. That's what we're looking at. Some other cards that we are looking at that are not on the reserve list, and we're going to switch things up a little bit here. Some cards that you don't see nearly as often in our... Ooh, can I see that? I'm going to go ahead and start. And this is a card I was extremely proud of because I found it, and you hadn't seen it, I believe. And then we got into discussing it a little bit, and that could do some stuff.
You're right, Mike. I have not seen this card, and that card is...
Ice Cave. 3 generic, 2 blue for an enchantment. Whenever a player plays a spell, any other player may pay that spell's mana cost. If a player does, counter that spell. Mana cost includes color. This is a 30-cent card in less than 200 decks. And we've had several conversations about stacks being something I don't like, because even though it's a symmetrical effect more times than not that says everybody can't play Magic, that's not exactly what I get out of it. I like Ice Cave because, hey, everybody can counter everything if you have access to it. This is such a fun, big mana, big like you're looking at 3, 4 color, 5 color commanders and saying, everybody, I'm going to give you access to everything. Here's all of the mana. Here's all of the cards. Also, everyone at the table has counterspells if they have the mana to pay for it. It's silly. I like it so much. It's so weird, Alex.
Yeah, Mike, when you showed me this card, and I will admit this is the first time that you've ever shown me a card on this podcast that I've literally never seen in my life, and I was very pleased about that.
I'm wringing my hands as a champion.
I immediately thought of Dream Halls.
Yeah.
Because this is kind of like the anti-Dream Halls, right? Instead of everyone
really
being able to play cards for free, it's anybody can say no for free. Well, they can't really say no for free, but they can say no without having the ability to say no. They can pay, they can just throw mana into the air and say no, right? But let's walk it back a bit and just look at that last clause. They'll pay the mana cost of that card if they do counter that spell.
Correct.
Mana cost is distinct from converted mana cost. Converted mana cost is you'll add up the amount of generic mana and all the mana pips and turn that into a number. And that number is the converted mana cost. This is not that. This is the mana cost. And mana cost, like the card says, includes color, right? It includes colored mana pips, generic mana pips, colorless pips, Phyrexian pips, hybrid pips, all that good stuff. It's all in there, right? So that means if you don't have the colored mana to pay for it, you can't counter the spell. So this card goes really well in, for example, 4 and 5 color decks, where you have lots of different colors of mana that you can counter spells with, like Kaneos and Tiro.
Oh, my boys, my sweet boys. That's what Ice.
Hey, those are my sweet boys. No, we can share the sweet boys.
Okay, I appreciate it. It's group hug. We're all sharing.
We're all sharing.
So, how does this work with X spells?
That's an excellent question, Mike. When you cast an X spell, one of the first things that you're going to do is choose a value for X. When you choose a value for X, that becomes the value for X, and that'll be the value in the mana cost, that'll be the value on the card itself, and that will be the amount of mana that you will pay for X when it's time to pay mana. And that means that if somebody would like to counter that card, they must pay that same amount. If you choose X equals 5, they will need to pay 5 generic mana and then any other colored pips that are a part of that spell.
So a big mana deck that's generating a lot of X spells. This can be some fun.
Yeah, it'd be hard to counter a big mana spell.
Oh yeah, this is I liked it, and then you basically helped me like it more. Speaking of things that we like, this is one that makes a lot of me very unhappy, but a very very small part of me overjoyed, because you brought up a white card that I had never seen before, and now I want 3 just to have them. Why don't you tell me about your card for this week, Alex?
Sure, Mike. But before I do, let's play a little game. How many decks is your card in?
My card... Don't do this to me, man.
I'm sorry.
My card
make you uncomfortable.
My card is in just under 200 decks. It's in about 193 decks, I believe.
Mike, my card's in 19 decks. Yeah, this is Drought. For 2 and double white. Enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice Drought unless you pay white. Spells cost an additional sacrifice a swamp to cast for each black mana symbol in their mana costs. Activated abilities cost an additional sacrifice a swamp to activate for each black mana symbol in their activation costs. Wow. So if you look at the original card, this is really important.
It's
on
very
the original
different.
Card on Ice Age, not only is it written differently and in tiny text that's hard to parse, but it also has black mana symbols on it. It's very important to note that in the Oracle text, those are not there. This is a mono white card. It's not an Orzhov card. All right?
Correct.
So, this card absolutely and completely hoses mono black decks. And pretty much any deck with black in it.
Any deck playing black.
If you played this card, the amount of value that somebody would have to be getting out of a black spell to be willing to sacrifice their swamps, unless they're also in a lands deck, in which case you're screwed, right? Because they'll do it every time. But barring that, how much value do you think you would need to get out of a black spell before you were willing to sacrifice a swamp for each black mana pip in its cost, or for its activated ability? It would have to be like Yawgmoth's Will level of powerful, or Necropotence. I mean, because you're sacrificing multiple lands. It's just mean. It's really mean, Mike.
And it's also in their mana costs.
Yeah, it's also worth noting here that black mana symbols also includes Phyrexian black mana symbols. So Keurig gets super hosed. Whether they pay life or mana, those Phyrexian black mana symbols are black. And that means that if they want to cast a spell for very little mana because they pay a bunch of life, they're going to pay a bunch of life and then sacrifice a bunch of lands. But Mike, they can't cast those spells if they can't sacrifice those swamps. So how do you help these poor people? They've ran out of swamps to sacrifice. Oh, I have an idea. Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth. This is a legendary land that says that all lands are swamps. Mike, that means they're free to cast any spell they want. They're just going to end up sacrificing all of their lands.
I feel like this card is like, if I have a friend in my play group who says, I think I'm going to make a Keurig deck, that's them basically opening up their trench coat to show me that they've got a gun. And then they're
writing a blank check for you to run this card. Yeah.
Right. This is where they show me that gun in their trench coat, and then I say, and I open my trench coat with my 25-cent drought card that is just a frickin' missile launcher, and say, you sure?
This is a nuke against black decks. This says absolutely not. You are done playing the game. You just sit there for the rest of the game. You're done.
Yeah, some parts of the politics in EDH is what happens outside of the game, and this is this is one of those don't do it cards. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. It's very mean, Alex. I'm very disappointed.
Well, Mike,
I'm gonna go by 3.
Sometimes we have to run mean cards to stop people from playing even meaner cards. The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a 25-cent card from Ice Age.
So sometimes when you're looking at cards like this and you're deciding what should go into your deck, those are the kind of evaluations that you have to make. And moving on to our something old, something new segment, my advice for new players. When you're adding new cards, making cuts, things along those lines in your decks, ask yourself this. How will this card do when it is A, in my starting hand, B, in the late game, C, when I'm winning, and D, when I need to stay alive? Now, I know there's a bunch of... We've talked about it a little bit before. There are 4 stages of the game that fluctuate. But instead of looking into those specifically, I'm looking more into the early, late, on top of the world, desperately struggling to survive. Those are my compass directions when I'm making a deck. If I have 1 or 2 of those moments where I feel good, hey, if this is in my starting hand, I feel great. Hey, if I'm winning, this is a great card. But if I need to stay alive, if I'm behind in the game, or if it's late and this doesn't do much for me, that card is only good half of the time, if not less. If I'm good when this is a card that saves me, but that's it, well, I mean, maybe I'm evaluating it a little bit different at that point. I think as kind of a rule of thumb, how is it when it's in my starting hand, in the late game, when I'm winning, when I'm desperately trying to stay alive? If it's good in 3 out of those 4 categories, I'm comfortable with putting it in the deck. And I know everybody, oh, look at all these cards that came out in the new set, stuff like that. I want to throw these in there because I'm so excited. Take a breath, relax, and think about it. Is this card good here, 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 here? And if you're getting at least a majority of those, then you're probably okay to put it in. What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, Mike, this is a little bit different from the way I would phrase it, but this is your advice section. And those 4 phases are perfectly fine for you.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important here to make the distinction between a card that functions in broad scopes, broad parts of the game, where you can use it readily and it's going to be useful to you throughout many different sections and many different situations. And then the extremes of that, which are win more cards and lose less cards. What do I mean by that? Win more cards are cards that only help you win when you're already out ahead. These are cards like Second Harvest, which is for each token you control, create a copy of that token. That's a great effect, but it's really only a really good effect when you have a lot of tokens. If you have no tokens, it's awful. If you have few tokens, it's not that good. You want to have a ton of tokens to play that card. So when I see that card, I think that's a win more card. It's only going to help me win more. And you can have some of those cards in your deck. That's okay. But you need to be aware that it's going to be useless to you unless you're already winning. So you would really want to limit the number of cards you put. And then there's also the negative extreme, which is lose less cards. Now, this one's a little bit more lenient in my book, right? Because you can look at cards like Teferi's Protection. It's a very powerful card, which says permanents you control phase out. You have protection from everything, and your life total can't change until the beginning of your next turn. You could look at that and say that's a lose less card. However, lose less cards, I think, to a certain extent, you don't want to have too many, but you do want to have some, because those are your main protection cards, right? Sometimes having a lose less card in place of a counterspell is even better than a counterspell. For example, Teferi's Protection saves your board, but not anyone else's.
Right.
But most of your cards, you don't want them to be win more or lose less. Like you said, most of them you want to be viable during the entire game, and that's what I had to add to your advice.
Absolutely. And even to round it out here, Teferi's Protection is such a good card because when you talk about lose less or win more, it's a good balance between the two of those, because it's not necessarily a lose less card because it's not protecting everybody. It's not stopping a bad thing from happening to you. It's stopping all bad things from happening to you for a good amount of time. And if that means that it keeps you in the game when you should lose, or it keeps you in the game at a pole position as the arch enemy because you've got such a staggering board state, well, okay. Like I said, it's not a perfect science with deck building, but make sure that you're not putting something in thinking Magical Christmas Land or Singular Situation, or that you're always going to be winning, because you're not. What's your advice for us this week, Alex?
Sure, Mike. My advice for veteran players is quite apropos, as usual, to our topic at hand, and that is to take a look at the reserve list, and also to older sets like Ice Age, like Drought, that just have a lot of long-forgotten cards in them that are pennies on the dollar, that have no place in competitive formats, and no place in most EDH decks. Or maybe they do, but they just haven't been discovered yet. Like, there are 25,000 plus cards in this game, and the fact of the matter is that we're consistently able to find cards that, in my opinion, are quite excellent and are in very few decks. And that means that those cards are still out there. So if you are looking to spice up your deck list, as I often am, look through these old and janky sets, especially Ice Age. Ice Age has some really fun ones with those cumulative upkeep costs. But also on the reserve list, because there are a lot of reserve list cards that are just flat out not that good. You can buy those cards and run them in your janky, silly commander deck, and then 10 years from now, that card will be $10 million because the reserve list is ridiculous and the prices keep just going up. This is not investment advice. I'm not a fiduciary.
I was going to say, so our advice for this week for everybody is the reserve list is something that we don't necessarily like. Go look at all the cards on it and buy them now because they're going to be worth so much more next week. Thank you for coming to my investment TED Talk. Also, no, none of that. I do like that, though. Whenever everybody wants the new shiny toys, unless you know every card in the Compendium of Magic, if you look back at some of these older cards, well, they're new to you, and some of them are ridiculous. Drought is gross. It's a ridiculous card. It costs $0.25.
Like, even I don't know all the cards in Magic's history, and case in point,
Right.
I don't know about Ice Cave, and Ice Cave is the exact kind of card I wish I would have known about. So it's always fun to discover fun new cards that you wish you knew about before. That's one of my favorite things. Wait, can I see that? Is not just a quirky name for a segment. That's what you want to hear, is you slam a card down on the table and you read it off and they say, wait, can I see that? And then they read it and they're like, when they look at that card and then they take their phone out and put that card on their maybe list because they love what the card is, that's the best feeling in the world, Mike. That's what you want to be happening all the time.
When you get to a point where you are literally, you play a card like Ice Age or Ice Cave or Drought, and they say, wait, can I see that? And they read the card, and then they look at the board, and then they read the card again. Chef kiss. That is,
there you go.
That is probably the best that you can feel about your deck making skills. Alex, thank you very much for explaining to us about what the reserve list is, some of the cool cards that you can find on it that, unfortunately, are either going to cost you a decent chunk of cash, or, hey, find a proxy. Heck, make one.
Of course.
It's fun.
Mike, it's always a pleasure, and I'm always happy to be here.
Absolutely, man. We will see you all next week. Until then, holidays are coming up. Keep the politic talk with your family at a minimum. Save it all for the magic table. We'll see you later.